September 18th, 1942. The Statler Hotel, Washington, D.C., 2:47 p.m. Vera Caldwell stood in the office of the assistant general manager and stared at the gold Bulova watch lying on the desk between her and three men in dark suits. The watch had been found an hour ago in the hotel restaurant, at table number 12, but by the time it turned up, Vera had already been summoned for a discussion. The walk from the fourth floor to the administrative offices on the second floor had taken less than 3 minutes, but those 3 minutes felt like an eternity. She had passed other maids in the corridors, girls she'd worked alongside for years, and seen them avert their eyes. Everyone already knew. In a hotel, news traveled faster than room service. Harlan Thorpe, deputy director of the War Production Board's Midwest region, sat in the leather chair by the window smoking a Lucky Strike. He was 51 years old with a heavy jaw, deep creases around his mouth, and cold gray eyes. He looked at Vera as though she were a piece of furniture that had suddenly spoken in a human voice and dared to contradict him. Through the window behind him, Vera could see K Street bathed in afternoon sunlight. Streetcars rattled past. People walked with purpose, carrying briefcases and shopping bags. The war had brought thousands to Washington, young women from small towns across America, drawn by the promise of government jobs and wartime urgency. Vera had been one of them, arriving in 1938 with $40 in her pocket and a reference letter from a hotel in Springfield, Illinois. "The watch was found," Vera said quietly. Her voice trembled despite her efforts to stay composed. "Mr. Thorpe, you left it in the restaurant. I didn't take anything from your room." Thorpe stubbed out his cigarette in the crystal ashtray with deliberate slowness. He glanced at Eleanor Pritchard, the assistant general manager, a woman with thick-framed spectacles who had worked at the Statler since it opened in 1937. Eleanor remained silent, her hands folded on the desk in front of her. She wore a charcoal gray suit with a cameo brooch at the collar. Her face was impassive, revealing nothing. One of the men in suits, the hotel's head of security, Dennis Harrington, shuffled through some papers with meticulous care. Dennis was a former police detective, hired by the Statler in 1940 to handle the increased security concerns as Washington filled with government officials, foreign diplomats, and military personnel. He had a reputation for thoroughness. __quote _3 __, Dennis said, not looking up from his papers. Vera felt a chill creep down her spine. Dennis nodded. He finally looked up at her. His eyes were brown, tired, professional. Vera opened her mouth, but the words stuck in her throat. The $20 had been given to her last night by a guest in room 407, a German refugee woman, Mrs. Ingrid Mueller, who had been staying at the hotel for 3 weeks. Mrs. Mueller was from Berlin, working as a translator for some State Department conference on refugees and displaced persons. She was in her 50s, with silver blonde hair worn in a neat bun, and spoke English with a heavy accent that made every sentence sound like it had been carefully rehearsed. When Vera brought her fresh towels and linens yesterday evening, the woman had been sitting by the window, looking out at the city with an expression of profound sadness. They had spoken briefly, about nothing important, just small talk about the weather and the hotel, and when Vera turned to leave, Mrs. Mueller pressed a $20 bill into her hand. "9, she said. 10, Vera had tried to refuse, but Mrs. Mueller insisted with such quiet desperation that Vera finally accepted, thanking her and leaving quickly before the woman could see the tears in her eyes. $20. More than Vera made in a week. She had planned to save it, to add it to the small emergency fund she kept hidden in her room. But now that $20 might cost her everything. Vera managed. Dennis looked at her with a long, measured gaze. Then he exchanged a look with Eleanor that Vera couldn't interpret. Something passed between them. Understanding, resignation, perhaps pity. "Your employee manual explicitly states that accepting gratuities from guests is strictly prohibited," Eleanor said. Her voice was flat, emotionless, as though reading from a card. This is considered an attempt to establish personal relationships with foreign nationals outside of professional necessity. In wartime, such relationships are subject to scrutiny. You understand this, Miss Caldwell. You signed the updated security guidelines last November. Vera remembered signing those papers. November 1941, just before Pearl Harbor. The hotel had called all the staff together and explained that with the war in Europe and tensions with Japan, security measures were being tightened. No personal relationships with foreign guests. No accepting gifts or money. Report any suspicious behavior. It had seemed reasonable at the time, patriotic even. Now those same rules were being used to destroy her. Harlan Thorpe rose from his chair. He walked to the desk with the slow, deliberate movements of a man who knew he had already won. He picked up his watch and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He looked directly at Vera, and she saw something in his eyes. Not anger, not accusation, but something colder. Satisfaction, perhaps. The satisfaction of a man who has successfully delegated blame. "I came to Washington for critical war production meetings," he said slowly. "Meetings that will determine how many tanks, how many planes, how many ships we can produce in the next 6 months. I have a tight schedule. This morning I discovered the watch was missing. I reported it to management immediately, as is my duty. They told me an investigation would be conducted. I agreed to cooperate fully. I don't know how the watch ended up in the restaurant. Perhaps one of the staff took it from my room, got scared when the investigation started, and planted it in a public place. Perhaps something else happened. I'm not here to speculate. But the fact remains. I wasted an hour and a half of my work time on this hotel matter instead of attending the War Production Board meeting on steel allocation." He fell silent. The office hung in stillness. Vera could hear a streetcar passing outside, rattling on the tracks. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She could hear Dennis turning pages in his folder, the whisper of paper against paper. "I didn't take your watch," she repeated. Her voice sounded small, defeated. "I cleaned your room at 9 in the morning. The watch wasn't on the nightstand. I would have seen it." "At 9 in the morning, I was having breakfast in the restaurant," Thorpe smirked. It was a small expression, barely visible, but Vera saw it. "I removed the watch when I washed my face at 7:30. I left it on the shelf above the sink in the bathroom. It's a habit of mine. I don't like getting water on the leather strap. When I returned to the room at 10:30 to collect my briefcase, the watch wasn't there. I searched the bathroom, the bedroom, everywhere. It was gone. I didn't go into the bathroom." Vera felt her voice breaking. "I only changed the bed linens and dusted the furniture. That's standard procedure. We're not supposed to clean the bathrooms while guests are staying in the room unless they specifically request it." "Miss Caldwell." Eleanor removed her glasses and wiped them with a handkerchief she kept in her jacket pocket. "We have Mr. Thorpe's testimony. He is a senior government official with an impeccable record. We have the fact that $20 of questionable origin was found in your personal belongings. We have a violation of company policy, accepting gratuities from a foreign national, a German national, during wartime. We've completed our internal investigation. The matter is closed." She put her glasses back on. She looked at the papers on her desk as though reading a verdict that had already been written. "Effective immediately. You are terminated for violation of company standards and loss of trust. Your employment file will be marked accordingly. You are barred from reapplying for any position with Statler Hotels at any location. You can pick up your final check from the payroll office tomorrow after 10 o'clock in the morning. You are required to vacate your room at the employee boarding house within 7 days." Vera stood there, not comprehending. The words reached her as if through cotton. Terminated. Loss of trust. Marked file. Barred from reapplying. 7 days to vacate. Each phrase was a blow, and she felt herself reeling under their combined weight. "But I didn't take anything," she whispered. "I've worked here for 4 years. I've never had a single complaint. Not one. I've never been late. I've never called in sick. I've covered for other girls when they needed help. I've worked double shifts during conventions. If there hadn't been complaints, we wouldn't have conducted an investigation. Dennis gathered the papers into a folder with a sense of finality. The decision has been made, Miss Caldwell. You may leave. Please return your employee badge and your room key to the front desk on your way out. Your personal belongings can be collected from your room at your convenience within the next 7 days. After that, anything remaining will be disposed of. Harlan Thorpe was already standing at the door. He opened it, gesturing for Vera to go first with exaggerated politeness. As she passed him, he leaned in slightly and said quietly, so only she could hear, "Next time, think before you go through other people's belongings." His breath smelled like cigarettes and coffee. Vera felt a wave of nausea. She walked through the door, and it closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like a judge's gavel. She stood in the corridor, lit by harsh fluorescent lights that made everyone look pale and sickly. She stared at the linoleum floor. The linoleum had a pattern, brown and beige diamonds forming an endless geometric sequence. She had counted those diamonds every day for the past 4 years while mopping the hotel corridors, while pushing laundry carts, while walking between rooms with armfuls of fresh linens. She had memorized the pattern. 6 brown diamonds in a row, then 2 beige, then 6 brown again. Now she was counting them for the last time. She heard footsteps behind her. She turned. Dennis Harrington was standing there, his folder under his arm. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Miss Caldwell," he said quietly, "a word of advice. When you apply for your next position, tell them you left here voluntarily. Tell them you moved to be closer to family, or that you took a position elsewhere. Don't mention the termination. They'll check references, and will confirm what you tell them. It won't help you much, but it might make the difference between getting a job in a factory or a laundry versus nothing at all." "Why are you telling me this?" Vera asked. Dennis shrugged. "Because I've been doing this job for 12 years. I know when someone is guilty and when they're just unlucky. You're unlucky, Miss Caldwell. You accepted money from the wrong person at the wrong time, and a man like Thorpe needed someone to blame. That's all this is. Bad timing and worse luck." "Then why didn't you say something in there?" Vera felt anger rising through her shock. "Why didn't you tell them I didn't take the watch?" "Because it wouldn't have mattered," Dennis said simply. "The decision was made before you walked into that office. The watch turning up in the restaurant didn't matter. The $20 didn't matter. What mattered was that Thorpe needed to save face, and you were convenient. Welcome to Washington, Miss Caldwell. This is how power works." He walked past her, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. Vera stood there for a long moment, then slowly made her way to the elevator. The elevator operator, a young man named Tommy who always hummed big band tunes while working, looked at her with sympathy. "4th floor?" he asked. "Front desk," Vera said. "I need to turn in my badge." Tommy said nothing. He closed the gate and pulled the lever. The elevator descended in silence. September 19th, 1942. Vera arrived at the payroll office for her final check at 5 minutes past 10. She had spent the previous evening packing her belongings. 4 years of life in Washington condensed into 2 suitcases and a trunk. Clothes, a few books, photographs from home, letters from her mother. Not much to show for 4 years, but it was all she had. The clerk at the payroll office, a woman around 45 with dyed red hair and a tired face marked by long hours and cigarette smoke, handed her an envelope and asked her to sign a release form. The form stated that Vera Caldwell acknowledged receiving her final compensation and waived any further claims against the Statler Hotel. Vera signed without reading it carefully. What was the point? She had no recourse, no money for a lawyer, no union to represent her. Just a piece of paper that said she agreed to everything. She opened the envelope. Her final pay. $40, minus deductions for Social Security and taxes. 4 years of work, countless hours of scrubbing floors and making beds and carrying heavy laundry bags up and down stairs, terminated in one afternoon and reduced to $40. She left the Statler building through the service entrance, not wanting to walk through the lobby where she might encounter former coworkers or guests who knew her face. Outside, it was a warm September day, the sun shining brightly on K Street. People walked with purpose, women in smart dresses and men in suits, everyone moving quickly as though late for important appointments. Cars moved past, mostly older models because of wartime restrictions on new vehicle production. A newsboy on the corner shouted headlines about the war in North Africa, about American troops landing at Guadalcanal, about the siege of Stalingrad. The war seemed very far away, and yet it had somehow reached into Vera's life and destroyed it. She held the envelope in her hands and thought about what to do next. She lived in a boarding house on H Street, a 5-story brick building that housed female Statler employees, mostly maids and laundresses and kitchen workers. Her room was on the 3rd floor, shared with 3 other women. She had a cot by the window, a footlocker for her belongings, and half a shelf in the communal closet. The boarding house charged $8 a week, which included 2 meals a day, breakfast and dinner. It was inexpensive by Washington standards, but only because it was subsidized by the hotel for their employees. Now that she was no longer employed, she had a week before eviction. Her residence permit in Washington was tied to her employment. The city was so overcrowded with war workers that the government had imposed restrictions. You needed a valid job or official business to maintain a residence. No job meant no valid reason to stay in the district. She could try to find another position within the week, but the notation in her employment file, __quote_42_, made that nearly impossible. Prestigious places, hotels, restaurants, department stores, government offices, wouldn't hire someone with that mark. That left factories, laundries, cleaning services, but even those asked for references from previous employers. And what kind of reference would the Statler give her? Vera walked to the streetcar stop on the corner of K and 15th Street. She waited with a crowd of other people, secretaries on lunch breaks, delivery men, soldiers in uniform. A streetcar arrived and she boarded, paying her nickel fare. She took a seat in the back and watched the city pass by through the dirty window. Washington had changed so much since she arrived in 1938. Back then, it had still felt like a sleepy southern town, hot, humid, segregated, moving at its own lazy pace. Now it was the center of a global war, crammed with people from everywhere, operating on nervous energy and constant urgency. She took the streetcar to H Street. The boarding house stood between a drugstore and a corner grocery. It was a plain building, no different from dozens of others in the neighborhood. Vera climbed the front steps and entered through the heavy wooden door. The lobby smelled like boiled cabbage and floor wax. Mrs. Kowalski, the landlady, looked up from her desk near the stairs. She was a stout Polish woman in her 60s with gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. "Miss Caldwell," she said. Her accent was thick, her expression neutral. "I received a call from the Statler this morning. They informed me of your situation. You have until next Friday to vacate your room. I'm sorry, but those are the rules." "I understand," Vera said. What else could she say? She climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor. The hallway was narrow, lit by a single bare bulb. She reached room 312 and opened the door. Inside, her roommate Dot was sitting on her own cot, still wearing her waitress uniform. Dot was 5 years younger than Vera, 23 years old, cheerful and talkative with a crown of blonde curls that she maintained with careful pin curls every night. She came from a farm in Virginia and sent half her wages home to her family every month. Now she looked at Vera with pity and fear combined. Pity for Vera's situation. Fear that she might be associated with someone who had been fired. Dot said quietly. Vera walked to her cot and sat down. The cot creaked under her weight. The mattress was thin, worn, patched in places. Dot said. She twisted her hands nervously in her lap. Vera smiled bitterly. Dot looked frightened, as though Vera's misfortune might be contagious. "They'll evict you from the boarding house. Where will you go? Do you have family in Washington?" "I have no one in Washington," Vera said. "My mother lives in Illinois, in a small town called Fairmont. She lives alone in the house where I grew up. Will you go back there? I don't know. Vera looked out the window. From here, she could see the street below. People walking, cars passing, life continuing as though nothing had happened. What would I do in Fairmont? The town has 800 people, one factory, a grain elevator, 3 churches, and a post office. There are no jobs for women except teaching or working in the diner. And everyone knows everyone. The shame of being fired would follow me everywhere. My mother would have to live with that shame. She's 64 years old. She doesn't deserve that. Maybe you could find work in another city. Baltimore, maybe? Or Philadelphia? Maybe, Vera said, but she didn't believe it. The word would spread. Hotels talked to each other. Employment agencies shared information. The mark in her file would follow her wherever she went. She was 30 years old, unmarried, with a record of termination for cause. In a city full of young, unmarried women desperate for work, why would anyone hire her? She had $20, the tip from Mrs. Mueller, the money that had cost her everything. $40 from her final check. $60 total. Rent for a week in a cheap rooming house would cost $5. Food, maybe $1 a day if she was careful. She had 2 months, maybe 3 if she stretched every penny before the money ran out. Then what? Charity? Begging? The thought made her sick, Vera said, but she didn't believe her own words. For the first time in her life, Vera Caldwell didn't know what came next. She had always been good at planning, at organizing, at making things work. But this was different. This wasn't a problem she could solve through hard work or determination. This was a door closing, and she didn't know if there was another way in. Dot stood up. 66, Vera said. And she did. In a world where jobs were precious and security was fragile, no one could afford to be associated with scandal. Dot wasn't being cruel. She was being practical. Survival came first. Dot left. Vera sat alone in the room. She looked at her footlocker, at the trunk in the corner, at the half shelf in the closet that held her few dresses. 4 years of her life, packed and ready to go. She had come to Washington full of hope, a young woman from a small town, ready to make something of herself in the big city. Now she was leaving with nothing but 2 months' worth of money and a ruined reputation. She lay down on the cot and stared at the ceiling. There was a water stain in the corner, shaped like a map of some unknown continent. She had stared at that stain countless nights, imagining the geography of that impossible place. Now she wondered if she would ever have a ceiling of her own to stare at again. September 1942 to June 1943. The next 9 months were a blur of cheap rooming houses, temporary jobs, and constant hunger. Vera found a room in a boarding house in southeast Washington, a neighborhood far from the grand government buildings and hotels, where the streets were cracked and the buildings sagged and the residents were mostly Negro families and poor whites who couldn't afford anywhere better. Her room cost $4 a week. It had a single bed, a chair, a hot plate she shared with 3 other boarders, and a bathroom down the hall. She found work at a commercial laundry on Massachusetts Avenue, washing linens for hotels and restaurants. The work was brutal, standing for 10 hours a day in a room filled with steam and the smell of lye soap, feeding sheets and tablecloths and napkins into enormous industrial washing machines, then hauling them wet and heavy to the drying room. Her hands cracked and bled from the constant exposure to hot water and harsh chemicals. She earned $55 a month, barely enough to cover rent and food. She ate 1 meal a day, usually a bowl of soup or a sandwich from a diner, supplemented by crackers and canned vegetables she ate cold in her room. She lost weight. Her clothes hung loose. Her face became gaunt. She developed a cough from the steam and the chemicals that lasted through the winter. In December 1942, the laundry laid off 20 workers because of labor shortages. Too many men had gone to war, and not enough women were willing to work under such conditions for such low pay. Vera was among those let go. She found another job 2 weeks later at a munitions factory in Arlington, across the Potomac River. The factory produced shell casings for artillery rounds. She worked the night shift, 11 at night to 7 in the morning, operating a metal press that stamped out casings from sheets of steel. The noise was deafening. The air was full of metal dust that made her lungs burn. She wore heavy gloves, but her hands were constantly covered in small cuts and burns from the hot metal. She earned $75 a month, better than the laundry, but the work was more dangerous. In January 1943, a woman named Betty Simmons got her hand caught in a press. They rushed her to the hospital, but they couldn't save her fingers. Betty was 22 years old, with a husband serving in the Navy somewhere in the Pacific. After the accident, she disappeared. Vera heard later that she had gone back to her parents' farm in West Virginia, unable to work, her war job over before the war was. Vera stayed at the factory for 6 months. She sent $5 a month to her mother in Illinois. Not much, but enough to show she hadn't completely fallen apart. She lived on the edge of exhaustion, sleeping fitfully during the day in her hot, stuffy room while the city roared outside. She had no friends, no social life, no entertainment except the radio she shared with other boarders in the common room. She existed. That was all. In June 1943, she received a letter from her mother. It was the first letter in months. They had exchanged only brief notes before, both too proud to admit how difficult things had become. Her mother wrote in her careful, old-fashioned hand, __, quote, _, 67 __. Vera read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her footlocker, in the bottom beneath her other belongings. She didn't write back immediately. What would she say? That she was living in a slum, working in a factory, barely surviving? That she had been destroyed by a lie and couldn't find a way back? That she was afraid she would never recover, never have a normal life again? Instead, she kept working, day after day, night after night. The war news came through the radio. Victories in North Africa, the invasion of Sicily, the slow pushback against the Germans and the Japanese. The war seemed to be turning. America and its allies were winning. But Vera felt like she was losing, slowly but steadily, one day at a time. Then, in late June 1943, something changed. The factory superintendent, a man named Frank Novak, a Czech immigrant with a thick accent and a permanent scowl, called her into his office after her shift. Quote, he said, quote, 70, Vera said immediately. $65 was less than what she made on the night shift, but day work meant a normal schedule, meant sleeping at night, meant not slowly killing herself with exhaustion and chemical exposure. Quote 71. Novak said, quote 72. Vera started the new job the following week. The warehouse was a vast space filled with rows of steel shelving holding stacks of shell casings, boxes of parts, drums of machine oil. Her office was a desk in a corner, with a filing cabinet, a ledger book, and a telephone. The work was exactly as Novak described, boring. She recorded numbers, checked shipments, filed papers, but it was clean, quiet, and safe. She could think. She could breathe. More importantly, it was a step back toward normalcy. She wasn't just a factory worker anymore. She was a clerk, an office worker. It was a small distinction, but it mattered. It meant she was climbing back up, slowly. She moved out of the terrible boarding house in Southeast and found a room in a slightly better one in Northeast Washington. This room cost $6 a week, but it had a window that opened, a door that locked, and sheets that didn't smell like mildew. She started eating 2 meals a day. She bought a new dress, her first in a year. She got her hair cut and styled at a beauty parlor. Small things, but they made a difference. She was beginning to feel like a person again, not just a body going through motions. And then, one morning in October 1943, she saw a notice on the factory's employee bulletin board. Statler Hotel, archive assistant needed. Applicants must be detail-oriented, reliable, and experienced with filing systems. Apply in person, Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. Ask for Mr. Robert Lindquist. Vera stared at that notice for a full minute. The Statler, the place that had destroyed her, the place she had fled, broken and humiliated. And now they were hiring. Her first instinct was to turn away. She had spent a year trying to forget that place, trying to build a new life. Going back would be insane. They would recognize her. They would turn her away. Or worse, they would humiliate her all over again. But something in her, some stubborn, angry core that had survived everything, refused to walk away. She had done nothing wrong. She had been wronged. And here was an opportunity, not for revenge, but for something else. A return. A reclamation. She copied down the information. That evening, after work, she went to the public library and asked to see a city directory. She found Robert Lindquist's name, archive manager, Statler Hotel. She had never heard of him. He hadn't worked there when she was employed. That meant he wouldn't know her face, wouldn't know her history. She went home. She opened her footlocker and pulled out her employment file from the Statler, the copy she had been given when she was fired. She read through it carefully. The termination notation was there, carefully worded. Terminated September 18, 1942. Violation of company standards. Not eligible for rehire. But if she applied under a different name, used a different reference, created a new identity? No, that was impossible. The payroll records would show her social security number. The files would reveal everything. She couldn't hide. Unless... Vera sat on her bed and thought. She thought about the archive, about file systems, about how hotels kept records, about how, in a building employing hundreds of people over years, records could be incomplete, misfiled, or simply lost in the chaos of war and turnover. She thought about the opportunity. Not just for a job, she had a job, but for something deeper, for closure, for the chance to return to the place where her life had been broken and prove that she had survived, that she was still standing. The next Monday, Vera took the morning off work. She told Frank Novak she had a doctor's appointment. She put on her new dress, the one she had bought in September, a dark blue cotton dress with a white collar, modest and professional. She styled her hair. She put on lipstick. She looked at herself in the mirror. She looked different. A year had aged her. Her face was thinner, her eyes harder. She had gray strands in her hair that hadn't been there before. She looked like someone else. Someone who had survived something. She took the streetcar to K Street. She walked to the Statler. She stood outside for a moment, looking up at the building. It looked exactly the same. Same brick facade, same revolving door, same brass nameplate. But she was different. She wasn't the frightened girl who had been escorted out of this building a year ago. She was someone else now. Someone harder. Someone who couldn't be broken again. She walked inside. The lobby was exactly as she remembered. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, polished wood reception desk. She recognized some of the staff, the bellhops, the desk clerks. None of them looked at her twice. Why would they? She was just another woman in a blue dress, one of thousands who passed through this lobby every day. She approached the front desk. The clerk, a young man she didn't recognize, looked up. "Can I help you, miss?" "I'm here about the archive assistant position," Vera said. Her voice was steady. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Lindquist." "One moment." The clerk picked up a telephone, dialed an internal extension, spoke briefly. "Mr. Lindquist will see you. Take the elevator to the basement level. Turn left when you exit. The archive is at the end of the corridor." Vera thanked him. She walked to the elevator. A different operator, not Tommy, who had taken her down on her last day. This one was an older man with white hair. He took her down to the basement without comment. She exited into a corridor she had never seen before. During her time as a maid, she had worked on the upper floors, guest rooms, suites, administrative offices. The basement was service territory, kitchens, laundry, maintenance, and archives. She walked to the end of the corridor. There was a door with frosted glass and a brass nameplate. Archive, R. Lindquist, manager. She knocked. "Come in," a voice called. Vera opened the door and stepped into another world. The archive was a large room with floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with files, ledgers, boxes, and bound volumes. The air smelled like paper, leather, and dust. Not unpleasant, almost comforting. A man sat at a desk in the center of the room. He was in his early 60s, with white hair combed back from a high forehead, wire-rimmed glasses, and a neat gray suit. He looked up as Vera entered. "Mr. Lindquist?" Vera said. "That's correct." He stood, extending his hand. "And you are?" "Vera Caldwell," she said, shaking his hand. No point in lying about her name. If he checked records, the lie would be exposed immediately. Better to tell the truth and see what happened. "I'm here about the archive assistant position." "Excellent. Please, sit." Lindquist gestured to a chair across from his desk. Vera sat. Lindquist returned to his own chair and pulled out a notepad. "Tell me about your experience, Miss Caldwell." "I've been working as an inventory clerk at a munitions factory in Arlington for the past several months," Vera said. She had prepared this speech. "Before that, I worked in a commercial laundry. Before that, She paused. Here was the moment, the decision. "Before that, I worked at the Statler Hotel as a housekeeping staff member from 1938 to 1942. Lindquist's pen stopped moving. He looked up at her, his expression unreadable. Vera said. She met his eyes, refusing to look away. Lindquist set down his pen. He leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. He said finally, quote, 98, quote, 99, Vera said, quote, 100, quote. Lindquist was silent for a long moment. Then he opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a folder. He opened it and read through the contents, obviously her old employment file. Vera watched him read, her heart pounding. Finally, he looked up. Quote, 101, quote, he said. Quote, 102, quote, quote, 103, quote, Vera said. Quote, 104, quote, Lindquist continued. Quote, 105, quote. Vera felt something catch in her throat. Dennis Harrington, the man who had told her she was unlucky, had left a note defending her. A small kindness, buried in a file, waiting for a year until someone found it. Lindquist said. Vera said. Lindquist closed the file. Vera said. Lindquist stood. He extended his hand again. Vera shook his hand. Quote 115. Quote 116. Lindquist said. Quote 117. Vera left the archive, walked down the corridor, took the elevator back up to the lobby, and exited through the revolving door. She stood on the sidewalk in the October afternoon sunlight and took a deep breath. She had returned. Against all odds, despite everything, she had returned to the place that had destroyed her. Not as a maid, not as someone to be ordered around and discarded. As an archivist. As someone who would know where every document was filed, every record stored, every secret kept. She smiled. It was a small smile, grim and cold, but it was there. She had survived. She had endured. And now she was back. November 1943 to September 1946. Vera worked in the archive for 3 years. She learned the filing systems, the catalog methods, the organizational logic that governed how information was stored. She learned which documents were important and which were routine. She learned how to find information quickly, how to respond to management requests efficiently, how to maintain perfect order in a room filled with thousands of files. She was good at the work. Better than good. She was meticulous, patient, and thorough. Lindquist recognized her talent. In March 1944, he gave her a raise to $80 a month. In July 1945, when the war ended and the hotel shifted back from wartime operations to normal peacetime business, he gave her another raise to $90. In January 1946, he promoted her to senior archive clerk at $100 a month. Vera saved her money. She moved out of the boarding house and rented a small studio apartment in Georgetown. One room, a kitchenette, a private bathroom, and a window that looked out onto a quiet tree-lined street. It cost $25 a month, which was expensive, but it was hers. Her own space, her own door, her own lock. She bought furniture, a bed, a table, 2 chairs, a bookshelf. She bought dishes, a radio, a lamp. She bought books, mystery novels, historical biographies, poetry collections. She read in the evenings, alone in her apartment, listening to programs on the radio. She lived a quiet, solitary life. She made no friends. She dated no one. She went to work, came home, read, slept, and returned to work. She was polite but distant with her coworkers. She had learned that attachment was dangerous, that caring about people or places meant vulnerability. So she kept everyone at arm's length. But she was happy in her own way. She was stable. She was secure. She had rebuilt her life from nothing. She had returned to the place that had destroyed her and made herself indispensable. That was enough. And during those 3 years, she noticed things. She noticed patterns in the hotel's records. She noticed which guests returned regularly. She noticed which government officials maintained permanent arrangements. She noticed discrepancies in billing records, unusual expenses, irregular stays. And she noticed Harlan Thorpe. September 1946 to March 1949. Harlan Thorpe returned to March 1949. Harlan Thorpe returned to Washington in September 1946. Vera saw his name in the reservation records. He was staying in the hotel for 2 weeks, attending meetings at the newly reorganized Department of Commerce. The war was over. The War Production Board had been dissolved. Thorpe now worked for the Civilian Production Administration, which handled the transition from wartime to peacetime manufacturing. Vera pulled his file. She read through his stay records from 1942. She read the incident report from that September day. She read Dennis Harrington's notes. She read everything. She felt nothing. No anger. No desire for revenge. Just cold curiosity. The man who had destroyed her life was back, sleeping in a room upstairs, probably not remembering her at all. To him, she had been a minor inconvenience, a problem solved and forgotten. To her, he had been the catastrophe that had shattered everything. But that was 4 years ago. She was different now. She was stronger. She was in control. She closed the file and went back to work. She didn't do anything. Not yet. She just watched. Over the next 2 years, Thorpe returned to Washington regularly. Always the same pattern. 2 weeks per month, staying at the Statler, attending meetings at Commerce or with various government agencies. His billing records showed the same guest room charges, the same restaurant bills, the same routine. But there was something else. Another name appeared in the records, always correlated with Thorpe's visits: Margaret Keating. She was a secretary at the Department of Commerce, staying at the hotel whenever Thorpe was in town. Different rooms, of course, but the timing was too consistent to be coincidence. Vera began keeping her own records. She made copies of registration cards, billing statements, dates, and times. She filed them in a folder marked Personal Research that she kept in her desk drawer. She didn't know what she would do with this information. She just collected it, methodically, patiently. Then, in March 1949, she saw something that changed everything. She was processing expense reimbursement requests from government agencies, a routine task, and she noticed a pattern. Harlan Thorpe's stays at the Statler were being billed to the Civilian Production Administration as official government travel. But Margaret Keating's stays were also being billed as government travel, even though she worked at Commerce and her travel should have been billed to a different account. Vera pulled both sets of records. She cross-referenced them with hotel billing statements. She found discrepancies. Meals billed as quote 119 that took place at midnight. Room service charges for expensive liquor. Late-night telephone calls between rooms. She understood immediately. Thorpe was having an affair with Keating, and he was billing it to the government as official travel. It was fraud. It was theft of federal funds. And it had been going on for years. Vera sat in the archive, surrounded by filing cabinets and ledgers, and thought about what to do. She could do nothing. She could file the records away and forget about them. Thorpe's affair was not her business. His fraud was not her problem. But she thought about that September afternoon in 1942, about standing in Eleanor Pritchard's office, being accused of theft, watching a $20 bill destroy her life. About Harlan Thorpe saying, quote, she thought about the year she had spent scrubbing floors and breathing metal dust. The year she had spent hungry and afraid and alone. She thought about justice. She opened her desk drawer. She pulled out the folder of documents she had been collecting. She added the new billing records. She made copies of everything. Then, she sat down and wrote a letter. March 25, 1949. The letter was addressed to the Office of Ethics and Standards, Civilian Production Administration, Washington, D.C. It was typed on plain paper, unsigned, factual, and cold. Quote 121 . She didn't sign her name. She made copies of the registration cards and billing statements, careful, thorough copies showing dates, amounts, room numbers, billing accounts. She attached them to the letter. She sealed everything in an envelope. On March 25, 1949, Vera left the hotel during her lunch break. It was a cool spring day, the cherry blossoms starting to bloom along the tidal basin. She walked 3 blocks to a post office on Pennsylvania Avenue. She bought a stamp. She addressed the envelope. She stood at the mail slot for a moment, holding the envelope in her hand. This was the moment. Once she dropped this envelope, there was no taking it back. The investigation would begin. Thorpe's career would be destroyed. His marriage would probably end. His reputation would be ruined. She thought about mercy, about forgiveness, about whether revenge was worth the cost. Then she thought about standing in that office 7 years ago, hearing the words quote 122 . Watching her life collapse because a powerful man needed someone to blame. She dropped the envelope into the mail slot. Then she walked back to the hotel, descended to the archive, and returned to work. She felt nothing. No triumph, no revenge, just a cold, quiet certainty. 7 years ago, Harlan Thorpe had destroyed her life with a lie. Now she had destroyed his career with the truth. Fair exchange. April to June 1949. 2 months passed. Vera worked in the archive. She filed documents. She maintained the catalogs. She told no one about the letter. She simply waited. In mid-May, a letter arrived for the hotel manager. It was from the Office of Ethics and Standards, Civilian Production Administration, requesting certified copies of all billing records and registration cards for Harlan Thorpe and Margaret Keating for the period 1946 to 1949. The hotel manager sent a clerk to the archive to pull the files. Vera provided them with professional efficiency. She made copies herself, certified them, sealed them in an envelope, and sent the clerk back upstairs. Then she returned to her work as though nothing had happened. In June, the rumors started. One of the secretaries in the hotel's business center, a woman named Louise, whose husband worked at the Department of Commerce, mentioned it at lunch in the staff cafeteria. "Did you hear? They're investigating that big shot from the CPA. Thorpe, I think his name is. Something about expense fraud and an affair with a Commerce Department secretary. My husband says they're saying he might be prosecuted, or at least forced to resign." Vera sat in the archive with the door half open and listened as the secretaries gossiped. I heard they found hotel bills showing he'd been carrying on with this woman for years. They say his wife is filing for divorce. She lives in Chicago, some kind of society woman. Can you imagine the scandal? They say he's going to be fired, barred from government service. It's all over commerce and CPA. Vera closed the archive door. She sat at her desk. She opened her desk drawer and looked at the folder of copies she'd kept, duplicates of everything she had sent to the government. The evidence. She thought about Harlan Thorpe, about his cold gray eyes, about his smirk, about his voice saying, quote, 127, quote. She thought about the 3 years she'd spent working in brutal conditions, about the nights she'd gone to bed hungry, about the shame, the poverty, the desperation, about the year it had taken her to claw her way back to something resembling a normal life. She closed the folder. She locked the drawer. She went back to work. Justice doesn't always look like triumph. Sometimes it just looks like balance, like the universe finally correcting itself. August 1949. The Washington Post ran a small article on page 12. Vera found it in the library during her lunch break. She read it standing at the periodicals rack, her sandwich forgotten in her hand. CPA official resigns amid ethics probe. The article stated that Harlan Thorpe, regional director of the Civilian Production Administration's Midwest office, had resigned following an investigation into misuse of government travel funds. The investigation, conducted by the Office of Ethics and Standards, had found that Thorpe had billed personal expenses to his official travel account over a period of approximately 3 years. The investigation also revealed that Thorpe had maintained an improper relationship with Margaret Keating, a Department of Commerce secretary, and had billed expenses related to that relationship as official government business. No criminal charges would be filed, the article noted, as Thorpe had agreed to resign immediately and repay all improperly claimed expenses, totaling approximately $847. He had been barred from federal employment and government contracting for a period of 10 years. The article also noted that Thorpe's wife, Constance, had filed for divorce in Cook County Circuit Court in Chicago. Vera read the article twice. Then she folded the newspaper, replaced it on the rack, and left the library. She walked back to the hotel in the August heat. The streets were crowded with tourists and government workers, people enjoying the summer day. She felt disconnected from all of it, as though she were walking through a scene in a movie, watching other people live their lives. She returned to the archive. She sat at her desk. She pulled out the folder one more time and looked at the documents inside. $847. That was what Thorpe had stolen from the government. For comparison, the $20 that had cost Vera her job would be worth about $60 in today's money, accounting for wartime inflation. Thorpe had stolen the equivalent of 14 of those $20 bills. 14 times Vera's crime. She thought about justice, about whether this felt like victory. It didn't particularly. Thorpe had lost his job, his reputation, his marriage. But he still had money. He still had connections. He would find something else, somewhere else. Men like Thorpe always did. They fell and landed softly, cushioned by wealth and privilege and a society that protected its own. Vera, on the other hand, had fallen and landed hard. She had spent a year in hell. She had clawed her way back through sheer determination, and she was still scarred by the experience. Still alone. Still living a small, careful life, afraid to trust, afraid to connect, afraid to be vulnerable. She had won, in a sense, but winning felt hollow. It didn't bring back those years. It didn't undo the damage. It just meant they had both been broken. Mutual destruction. Zero-sum revenge. She closed the folder. She locked it in her desk drawer. She never looked at it again. Epilogue. December 1952. Vera Caldwell had worked in the Statler Hotel archive for nearly 9 years. She was 41 years old. Gray strands threaded through her dark hair, and she had stopped bothering to dye them. Her face had aged, Lines around her eyes, around her mouth, the marks of a life that had been harder than it should have been. But her eyes remained sharp, intelligent, observant. She had learned to see everything and reveal nothing. She lived in a small apartment in Georgetown, a one-bedroom place she'd rented in 1950 when she'd gotten a raise to $120 per month. The apartment had a bedroom with a real bed, a living room with a sofa and armchair, a kitchen with a proper stove and refrigerator. She had made it comfortable. Curtains on the windows, rugs on the floors, paintings on the walls. Books lined the shelves. A radio sat on the end table. It was a good life. Quiet, orderly, safe. She never heard anything more about Harlan Thorpe after the newspaper article in August 1949. He disappeared from Washington, from the government, from her awareness. Perhaps he'd moved back to Chicago. Perhaps he'd taken a job in the private sector. Perhaps he'd retreated into obscurity. Vera didn't care. For her, that chapter had closed the moment she read about his resignation. The debt had been paid. The account was settled. One afternoon in December 1952, Robert Lindquist came down to the archive. He was 69 years old now, moving slowly, talking about retirement. He sat in the chair across from Vera's desk, the same chair she had sat in during her interview 9 years earlier.
"Miss Caldwell," he said,
"You've worked here for over 9 years now. You do excellent work. The best I've ever seen, honestly. I'd like to offer you a promotion before I retire. Senior Archivist, $150 per month. You would essentially run this archive. When I leave, probably next summer, you would be in charge. Are you interested?" "Yes," Vera said without hesitation. "Thank you, Mr. Lindquist." Lindquist stood to leave. He paused at the door, his hand on the doorknob. He stood there for a moment, not speaking, his back to her.
"You know, Miss Caldwell," he said finally, not turning around,
"I sometimes get the feeling that you've been here before. Before you started in the archive, I mean. Not just working here. Everyone who works here has been here before in that sense. But something else. Some other connection to this place. But I can't quite place it. It's like seeing a familiar face in a crowd, but not being able to remember the name." Vera looked at him steadily. She knew he couldn't see her expression with his back turned. She considered her response carefully. Quote, 136, quote, she said calmly, her voice revealing nothing. Quote, 137, quote, 138, quote. Lindquist nodded slowly. Quote, 139, quote. He turned to face her, and she saw something in his eyes. Not suspicion exactly, but a kind of gentle knowing, as though he understood more than he was saying. Quote, 140, quote, 141, Vera said. He left, closing the door softly behind him. Vera sat alone in the archive, surrounded by filing cabinets and card catalogs and endless stacks of documents. Her kingdom, her domain. She looked around the room. 10 years since that September afternoon in 1942. 10 years since she had stood in an office upstairs and heard the sentence that had destroyed her life. 10 years since she had been escorted out of this building, humiliated and broken. She had survived. She had endured. She had returned to the place where she'd been destroyed and made it hers. Not through luck or privilege or connections. Through patience. Through discipline. Through the slow, methodical accumulation of knowledge and power. She had learned that the world was not fair, that powerful men could lie and destroy lives without consequence, that justice was not guaranteed, that sometimes, if you wanted things to be made right, you had to make them right yourself. She had learned that information was power, that knowing where things were, what things meant, who had done what and when, that knowledge was worth more than money, more than status, more than anything. She had learned to be patient, to wait, to watch, to strike only when the moment was right, and then to strike precisely, coldly, without mercy. She regretted nothing. Not the letter to the ethics office, Not the revenge, not the years spent rebuilding. She had gone through hell and survived. She had returned to the place where she'd been broken and made herself stronger. She had learned patience, precision, cold determination. Most importantly, she had learned that she was not helpless. That even from the bottom, even with nothing, a person could fight back, could win, could make the powerful pay for what they had done. Justice doesn't always come quickly. Sometimes it takes years. Sometimes it takes a single letter, a few documents, a careful plan. But it comes. Always. Vera opened the next file folder on her desk and continued working. The archive was quiet except for the rustle of pages and the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Life went on. Documents were filed in neat stacks. History was recorded on paper and stored away in perfect order. And somewhere, far in the past, in September 1942, a young hotel maid named Vera Caldwell stood in an office and heard the sentence, "Terminated for violation of company standards and loss of trust." That Vera had long since disappeared. In her place remained someone else, a senior archivist, a woman with sharp eyes and an iron memory, and a quiet, cold certainty about how the world worked. A woman who remembered everything, always. A woman who understood that in this world, survival meant being smarter than your enemies, more patient than your opponents, and willing to wait as long as it took for the moment when justice could finally be served. She had waited. She had remembered. And when the moment came, she had acted. That was enough. That was everything. Outside, snow began to fall on Washington, D.C., covering the city in white. Inside the archive, Vera Caldwell continued her work, filing papers in their proper places, maintaining perfect order in a world that was anything but orderly. She was home. Finally, after everything, she was home.